Hello, hello. There we go. Bonjour. Hello, everyone. My name is Michael Scholz. I work for CommerceTools, running product and customer marketing. A pleasure to be here today. The next 30 minutes are going to be in this sort of fast and furious style because I thought it would be a good opportunity since the next director is French, if you're familiar with the movie franchise. Next slide, please. Fast and Furious is obviously one of the most successful movie franchises in the world, and you can go to the next slide. And Louis Leterrier is actually taking over the 10th franchise of this movie. You might know him from The Hulk and The Transporter and sort of other sort of French-inspired movies. And so what I thought about was to kind of like stay in this theme of Fast and Furious because this is kind of like how we feel in this Mach composable journey, also as CommerceTools, having founded a lot of the notion, coined the terms, etc. So if you go to the next slide, I'm going to start literally going through each of the different movies, kind of like try to adapt the theme, and I hope you enjoy that. So the first movie, 2001, so quite a while ago, almost a little over 20 years ago, was really about introducing the idea of street racing, cars, the passion about it, and pretty much being treated like a rock star if you were part of that. Next slide. But as we all know, most cars at that point in time looked like this. I mean, they probably got you from A to B, but it wasn't like the supercar that you see on the next slide, which is what we think a commerce platform could look like. Really kind of like nimble, agile, fast. You're using only the best parts, the best components, kind of like the best of breed notions. And that's kind of like really where we think CommerceTools is dominating in the commerce portfolio kind of like market. And if you go to the next slide, we've coined a lot of these terms that you might have heard in the world. And it's all about MACH, Mach. You hear about headless, you hear about composable. So similar like the first movie, setting the scene a bit, it's really around understanding what all of these terms mean. So Mach is really kind of like encapsulating business capabilities in microservices. The way that you communicate to each of one of these is through APIs. That effectively is the communication protocol. Cloud native means everything that we have done, everything that we have built is built in the cloud, for the cloud, by the cloud. It's not some code base stored and saved and deployed on some server in some basement somewhere in your company. And headless, the most simple explanation for headless is really the notion of decoupling front and back end. It's not necessarily a new term, a new paradigm, a new approach. It's really just taking this series for the first time, decoupling front and back end. And all of this to create all of these stunning and amazing experiences in all of the different environments. So composable commerce effectively is that next step up. It's that next step in that evolution. So you go from headless to composable. And what that means is you're not only decoupling the front and the back end, you're decoupling everything. You're decoupling the search, you're decoupling the product catalog, you're decoupling the promotion engine, but also the commerce engine. And if you truly believe in this concept, everything is replaceable, even the commerce engine. So if you go to the next slide, what that actually means is, next slide. What we have done is, again, we've not only decoupled the head, so all of the digital touch points that you could possibly think of, so you can talk to smartphones and in-store and in your car and sort of other devices. We also decoupled our platform under the hood. So we have APIs that are specifically for content, for commerce, for the product catalog. And as a business, as a retailer, you can not only consume them technically, independently, but also commercially. Because what you've seen in the past is you're buying this big box, this big black box, and you have to pay for that entire big black box, even though you don't need the content management system or the order management system. And then on the right-hand side, you also see that sort of gray area or that gray bar, which is really business packaged capabilities that you can build for yourself, meaning either to other systems, whether those are integrations, or whether those are functionalities that you want to build because your business is so unique. Next slide. And so the notion for us is really to be able to build these experiences and drive that sort of adoption with customers. You need a modern commerce stack, irrespectively of industry, of customer segment, of market size, or the buying complexity, to be honest. Next slide. Going to the second movie in the franchise, if you're familiar with the second one, everything happens initially in California, so on the west coast of the United States. And then Brian O'Connor in this case starts over in Miami, makes new friends, and sort of gets into the scene over there. And next slide. And so the theme is really around starting over. Like, you failed in California, and now what does that mean? And so if you take that to kind of like the commerce space, what you will see is this sort of evolution of platforms. So on the left, you had that massive big box. So you had the Oracle Commerces, you have the WebSpheres of the world that were really kind of like the first companies in market. They were all about capturing that transaction. It's all about the .com boom, it's capturing that transaction. The next move over is still a black box, but commerce vendors realized there's an experience layer on top. That is a content management or a digital experience platform that is required to service and satisfy the users both in B2B and B2C. Still a black box though, and all of these on premise. And then you sort of moved into the evolution into the API suites where you still had a big box, but some of the functionality was exposed through APIs. Not all of the functionality, maybe just the cart, maybe just the order, maybe just sort of a handful of APIs. And you were also able to sort of, for the first time, build your own front end as opposed to always buying a front end or always leveraging a content management system or a digital experience platform. So I think where not only we are going, but also where the market is going, is to this sort of a la carte approach where you say, I want an order management system from here, my CMS from here, my commerce engine from here, my promotions engine from here, really following that best of breed notion. Really almost like the supercar initially, where you get, I don't know, Michelin tires, and you get the engine from Toyota, and you get an engine or other parts from different vendors, but really like honing in onto this best of breed notion. If you go to the next slide, you see this also kind of like in a timeline where a lot of these companies over here were founded in the late 90s, early 2000s. I think ATG IPO'd in maybe 97. Hybris was founded at the same time. But what you see here, the graph in the middle, the orange piece, is when the iPhone came out. So that was all like 15 years ago. And so what you have to understand is that each one of these platforms was really built for the desktop experience and the desktop experience only in mind. And later we went to omni-channel and multi-channel and all of those buzzwords. And what you also see is kind of like the adoption of cloud infrastructure. Like Google Cloud Platform and AWS didn't really exist kind of like until like 2010 when it sort of became more mainstream. I mean, maybe they've worked on it, maybe it existed a little bit more, but you can see that sort of proxy for cloud maturity at the end. So there's very, very few companies that have actually taken advantage of this cloud native approach, and I think that's why this is an interesting thinking here or approach here. And if you go to the next slide, here's really what the difference is. You've seen the 15 years there. When I think about 15 years, I might look at this, but it's really the BMW over there. If you're familiar with the first Louis movie, The Transporter, that BMW in that scene was from 91. That BMW 8 Series was from 91. So that's when none of these platforms were even in the market. So if you go to the next slide, the notion or the theme here really is to build these modern experiences, you need modern tools, you need modern technology. And that not only helps the techies in the room, the IT teams, the IT departments, but also the business user in the room. And maybe one piece of advice on the next slide is really, if you want to understand what you're dealing with, you got to pop the hood. You got to like look out under the hood to see what's actually real. If you can't sign up for a trial, if you have to talk to the vendor, if you can't even like install like a little system to play around, it's probably not SaaS, it's certainly not Mach, it's probably not modern technology. So I think that's really an interesting one to understand. If you go to the next slide, you come to the third movie, which is Tokyo Drift, which was kind of like an outlier in this whole series because it was in Japan, it was different actors, and it was really around this Sean guy who felt like an outsider, and street racing was everything for him. So if you go to the next slide, I want to sort of reiterate the notion that some vendors are drifting around but not really hitting the mark. I spent 10 years at SAP, and at the time it was amazing, but the amount of times that I heard 360-degree view of the customer, and that every single year and nothing has changed, is interesting. And I think there's a couple of points here where we're talking about online marketplaces. We're in the B2B space, we're talking about self-service portals, but these are reoccurring themes. They're not really sort of being solved for, whether it's data-driven analytics or insights or personalization. We keep hearing those, and I think the composable or the Mach approach would be to really use the vendors in that space that know what they're doing, kind of like the best of breed. You're picking the best for commerce, you're picking the best for search, you're picking the miracles for marketplace, for example. So you're building out your modern tech stack with the partners that you need and trust. Next slide. Fast and Furious, I think this was number 4, really around kind of like the main characters coming back together, but also putting their differences aside. And what that means for commerce, in the next slide, is really the notion that we're not differentiating from a commerce perspective. We think the commerce platform or the commerce portfolio of the future is industry agnostic, business model agnostic, customer segment agnostic, and it doesn't actually matter what your digital maturity is. So to dig into or double click into that a little bit deeper is, for us, it's supporting a digital transaction. That could be a digital transaction online, or it can be a digital transaction in store, but we don't actually care where or what industry this is in. If you have a digital transaction in healthcare, that's perfectly fine. If you're working in retail, that's fine. If it's in manufacturing and you're a B2B manufacturer, maybe even a distributor, we can support those, and you only have to buy one platform, not like 2, not like 3, not like 3 implementations, etc. Same with business model agnostic. I think the platform of the future is a platform that supports all of these different scenarios and segments. Doesn't matter whether that transaction is in B2C or B2B, or you're a B2B manufacturer going into a direct-to-consumer model. Shouldn't matter. It's the same digital transaction. It's the same card object. It's the same order API. Similar with customer segments. Doesn't matter whether you're small, large, somewhere in between. Doesn't matter. You're still using the same platform, and you can scale. One thing that our chief strategy officer always said is, CommerceTools is a platform where you can grow into, but never out of. So it grows with you. A lot of companies play that or articulate that, but here you can really grow to the pace that you're looking at. And next slide. I think the key point here is, I know it's a busy slide, but the key point is the bottom right, where it literally says, and this is by Gartner, if you don't adopt a composable approach to some or another extent, you will be outpaced by your competitors. You need to be that bold, that innovative, and that creative, and that flexibility only a composable approach can give you. Next slide. So Fast 5, again, another episode in the franchise, and it's really around regaining their freedom for the last time. So if you go to the next slide, we're still looking at some sort of a box. Vendors will always give you some sort of a box, right? But if we're looking at a modern commerce stack, this is probably the basis of what you're looking at. And each of those can come from a different vendor. It really depends on how you want to compose your own tech stack in that. And obviously there's multiple other things that you can do, maybe in-store, maybe some RFID stuff, maybe more clienteling. There's obviously lots around, but this is really the basic that we think a modern commerce stack should contain. Next slide. Fast and Furious 6 is really around, again, the whole notion of the crew, and I think it's really important that this is no longer about a platform. If you go to the next slide, it's really the notion of your best-in-class ecosystem. Our Chief Strategy Officer and CEO last week had a call with one of the retail leaders at Microsoft, and he was also sharing it's no longer about having the best platform in the market. It's really about having the best ecosystem that can help you build your commerce stack, your modern commerce stack. And this applies to both the technology partners, but also the system integrators, the agencies, or other sort of solution partners. And it's really around how do you build this out for your particular retail scenario. Next slide. And again, that innovation drives a lot. You have to have these modern ISV partners. If they're used to like an old school, maybe even waterfall implementation approach, probably not working out. You need modern ISV partners, you need modern service partners to build out these scalable and seamless, amazing customer, like modern commerce technologies. Next slide. So coming from kind of like where everybody regains their freedom, which is kind of like the liberation, this is kind of where you go and move off the monolithic legacy platform. Everybody's sort of settling down, living normal lives in this particular movie, but you never know what life is throwing at you. Similar to this crew here, because this was the movie that Paul Walker died by filming this movie. So if you go to the next slide, it just means that you need to be, again, agile, nimble, flexible, whatever happens, whether it's happening in your team, whether it's happening in the market. It's all about being flexible, nimble, agile, and also understanding the business benefits. It's not all about the tech, right? The tech is cool, the tech is fancy, you're working with APIs and microservices and a lot of other fancy buzzwords, but understanding what that means for your business, understanding that this is about you owning the customer experience, it's about you going to market quicker. We have a customer in the US, LLB, a massive retailer that was sitting on IBM WebSphere for the longest time. They wanted change. They wanted to build in-store into their sort of digital strategy even more so. They started out with just using 3 APIs from our portfolio. They didn't do a big bang implementation or migration. They just said, you know what, I want these 3 APIs and I'm going to start slowly to evolve with CommerceTools to grow with CommerceTools. And the notion is always kind of like the same. They never want to upgrade again. Like having these sort of traditional upgrade path, which doesn't exist with Mach, doesn't exist with SaaS, because all of these solutions are multi-tenant SaaS solutions. They were always on the last release. They never wanted to upgrade again, and that's why a lot of companies come to CommerceTools, a lot of retailers come to CommerceTools, because they never want to endure the pain of upgrading again. And sort of understanding that, figuring out how you can go to market very fast, whether you're acquiring a new company, whether you're acquiring a new brand, whether you're saying, you know what, I want to have these storefronts, I want to go into different geographies. All of this is possible, even with one platform under the hood. Even if you want to do different business models. I spoke about B2C and B2B. Some vendors have multiple platforms, either by building them or through acquisition. Again, for us, it's completely irrelevant if this is a B2B transaction or a B2C transaction. It's all the same for us under the hood. Again, understanding these business benefits, how you can be agile, how you can build out your tech stack for the future to be future-proof are some of the business benefits of this composable. Next slide. Fate of the Furious, that was kind of like, again, still with the same theme of unexpected things happening. And if we were looking at the next slide, we're seeing that everything is happening these days. I think you need to click through a couple of times there. Can you? Yeah, do it a couple of more times. But the notion here really is that everything is happening at the moment, right? We have pandemics, we have inflation, supply chain shortages, things of that nature. We have the conflict in Ukraine. You can't always be prepared for everything that the world throws at you or some of the internal struggles maybe you have as a team. but at least a modern commerce stack gives you that nimbleness, this agility to do all that. Same if you go to the next slide and click 4 times. These are all the things that happened like a year or 2 ago, right? I think TikTok is over even 2 billion right now in terms of users and has enormous potential. You have COVID that accelerated the digital transformation aspect of retailers. Specifically, you have NFTs, effectively just pictures or JPEGs that are glorified but are worth billions. And then you have a new channel with the metaverse that companies are building up. We have a customer, H&M, that is currently building out their metaverse. Nike and Adidas are doing that too. So just interesting things happening, and who would have known the metaverse would have even existed a few years ago. If you go to the next slide, really, again, sort of understanding the notion what is happening here, and again, this notion and theme of being ever prepared. So if you go to the next slide, it's really this notion of being competitive. So if you look at some of the stats on the right-hand side, all of them will tell you that, for example, the second point, 60% of leading B2B companies weren't even enabled or had a capability around e-commerce before the pandemic started. You hear about best-in-class customer experience, unified commerce, like a lot of these reoccurring themes that drives more customer retention, customer loyalty, and also revenue for retailers. So that's really the notion there. Next slide. And this is really kind of like the notion of dealing, like in this movie specifically, Dominic, the character of Dominic, is dealing with his other son that was sort of just written into the story. And it's about, if you go to the next slide, just sins of the past, things that have happened in the past. And again, just because you are on a monolithic platform, just because you are on a legacy platform, doesn't mean that you have to continue living with that. Like this is really, I think, where we see the market going. This is where Gartner sees the market going. This is where we see a lot of the Mach vendors going. It is really the notion of, again, decoupled front and back end, but also decoupling the entire modern commerce stack. And the last one, next slide. The last movie is still to come out. Again, this is the maybe last, who knows? Maybe there's another version or release, you never know, that the French director Louis will do. But what I want to leave you with is this notion, if you go to the next slide, is really about, again, that nimbleness, that agility to be future ready. And it starts with how you do business today, what modern commerce stack you build out. And if you go to the next slide, click again. What we see is these main challenges arising right now and going into next year. It's all about this, we are in a recession or we're going into a recession, we want to deal with that. That's why we need to be flexible. This is why we need to scale out. And on the right-hand side, total cost of ownership is really like a topic that's near and dear to me, because I think having worked on the legacy monolithic platform side for so long, they define total cost of ownership solely by how much license you pay for, what your fees are. But there's so much more, like how much revenue are you missing out by not being able to go into this market right now, or not servicing a touch point right now, right? It's all about taking that opportunity and putting a dollar value or a euro value behind that. And I think the underlying microservices, APIs, the fact that you can scale through the cloud, and the whole notion of Mach, the whole concept, the whole paradigm, the whole approach of Mach is very, very interesting. And if you go to the next slide, those are just 3 customer examples that we have where, again, these companies joined CommerceTools or signed up with CommerceTools because they wanted to get that increase in functionality. They wanted to be more agile. And again, you can see with Herbalife being a massive healthcare brand out of the US, this doesn't just apply to retail. This applies to every segment, every industry, every business model. But the notion is, you want to focus on something like decreasing checkout, increasing conversions, things of that nature. You want to optimize your total cost of ownership. Those are all real life use cases and scenarios where people are moving to a Mach approach, a composable approach to be able to do all of the above. And that is it. I hope you find it interesting. Hopefully there are a few Fast and Furious lovers out here. And thank you.